Okay, well, good morning everyone, and thank you for inviting me once again. I'm really the sort of warm-up act today to sort of try and set the scene. So if we go back just over a year, we were here or upstairs anyway, and that was a symposium that was specifically thinking about the import of honeybees into the UK and going through the various arguments about why it's not a terribly good idea and so on. And we visited Mount Edgecombe and looked at the reading there, and we had a pleasant day. We had some overseas speakers. We had Alice Pinto from Portugal and Maria Buga from Greece. And I think everyone agreed it was a very successful day. And when it was suggested that B4 might organise something similar this year, I think it was very clear that yes, it would be good to have another meeting, but it must be on something completely different. We certainly didn't want to revisit what was done last year. However, there are a few things that have happened since that last year that are quite relevant to the story, which I just need to sort of update people on. So really, what's happened in the last period since we last had a meeting? And I really didn't want to mention queen imports at all, but sadly they're still very much in the news, and in particular in the Bee Farmer magazine, which some of you may see, there was an article in the latest issue called "Safeguarding Our Bees, the Truth About Queen Imports" by Kirsty Stainton, who works for the National Bee Unit, and is very much on the button on what the official procedures are and so on. So this is explaining the procedures that you go through to import bees into Great Britain. And it includes this, I shall step over there. It includes this graph, which shows how queen imports went up, reached a peak in 2020, and have fallen since then, which is great. And she actually says here, the number of queens imported directly into GB in the early 2010s was in the region of 10,000, increased, blah, blah, peaked at 30,000, and has dropped off to 10,000, which is great. But then she says, however, this number may not reflect the true number of imports into Great Britain each year, as some queens are imported into Northern Ireland and then moved to Great Britain under the Windsor Framework, which is a post-Brexit arrangement. And yes, that's actually true, but some queens is actually quite a lot of queens. And this is the actual data. So this is her official figures for Great Britain, and this is the total if you include all these queens that come in through Northern Ireland. And this data has only been obtained by the Ulster beekeepers with a lot of hard work and talking to ministers and so on. And yes, the situation is very strange. Notice that there was no history of imports into Northern Ireland prior to Brexit. It's a total post-Brexit thing. So the figures actually are that in 2025, there are 22,000 queens came into Northern Ireland from Italy, Malta, Hungary and Germany, we know that. But we don't know where they go. As far as we know, they probably all come to Great Britain. They could stay in Northern Ireland, they could go to the Irish Republic, but everyone seems to think they all come to Great Britain directly, but we really don't know. So of the places they come to, Hungary has a direct border with Ukraine, which is believed to now have tropilelaps, and I shall come back to that in a minute. And the firm supplying queens in Malta rears many of its queens in Scilly, where small hive beetle has turned up several times, and the suspicion is some of those queens from Malta may actually come directly from Scilly. And from the information the Ulster beekeepers have obtained, in 2025 there were 47 visual inspection of queen cages, which sounds great, but out of 22,000, that's a very small number. And asked the direct question. DAERA, which is the Northern Ireland Authority, they do not hold or collect information on the final destination of these queens, so they don't know where they go. So if you look at that total graph, 70% of the queens coming into the United Kingdom are now coming from this route. And it's worth noting that the only successful occasion where an incursion of the small hive beetle has been dealt with successfully was in Portugal in the early 2000s, and that was a shipment came from the United States. The attendant workers and queen cages were sent to the lab and were inspected. They found small hive beetle eggs in them. They knew where they'd gone. They went to the hives, destroyed those hives, fumigated everything, soaked the soil, and got rid of them. Now, if the same situation applies, and, for example, small hive beetle is found in Malta, we would not be able to do that because we wouldn't know where those queens had gone. But we are told it's all okay because the queens coming in via Northern Ireland are from the EU and have traces certificates. So traces is an EU-wide system for monitoring the movement of live creatures and so on, and there are veterinary inspections at the origin. But these are some words by Northern Ireland bee inspector, or recent Northern Ireland beekeeper, pointing out the difficulties. What's to stop the beekeeper sending a different batch after they've been inspected by a vet? What's to stop a monthly or weekly inspection by a vet, but each batch might not be seen? What is to stop the vets looking at some of the mini nukes, but not all? What's to stop small hive beetle, and may not be long before we're talking about Tropilelaps, being found beside the queen rearing unit a week after the bees have been posted, so who knows where the queens are? They might be Northern Ireland, Scotland, England or Wales, and don't say the Republic of Ireland. The present system is a joke, but not fit for purpose. So that was Tom Williamson, the former Northern Ireland bee inspector last year. So that's not an ideal situation. Something that was positive though, October 2025, despite the fact that Tropilelaps has not officially been found and described in Ukraine, the UK government, or DEFRA, did actually take action to stop imports from Ukraine, and Canada has done likewise, so that was good. And meanwhile in Europe, this is the European Beekeeping Association last week or so, asking the European Union to ban imports from Ukraine, Belarus, and pointing out that there is considerable trade between Georgia, which now has Tropilelaps, and Turkey, urging the European Union to take similar action. So there is international concern about the spread of the Tropilelaps mite. And there have been a number of pieces of research published since we were last here that make us more concerned about the Tropilelaps mite than we were before. So if you look in textbooks, they tend to say that the Tropilelaps mite has remained confined to Southeast Asia, and that it's unlikely to be a problem in temperate climates because it can only live and reproduce in the brood of the bees, and it can't live for very long on adult bees in the way that varroa mites are, and therefore it's not going to be a problem in temperate countries where there is a brood bake in the winter. However, as we discovered last year, it is doing quite well in Georgia and in southern Russia, where it is quite cold in the winter, and they do have a significant brood break. And the paper that described the finding of Tropilelaps in southern Russia actually includes an experiment where they monitored over winter for Tropilelaps mites, and they seem to just disappear in the winter. So they're there in the autumn, they're there in the spring, they're not there in the winter despite diligent searching. So where they go is a mystery. But they seem to be doing quite well in those situations. In the UK, we finally have a new pest risk assessment for Tropidolaps mites. The previous one was dated from 2012 and was predated movements of Tropidolaps around. It does incorporate new information, and under risks of entry it says the highest risk pathways of entry are importation of Apis mellifera queens, on which there were controls and movement of used beekeeping equipment, which were both assessed as moderately likely with medium confidence. Due to the likelihood of mites being present and surviving the import process. And then risk management options, it says, entry can be prevented by quarantining imported queens, attendants and used hives to ensure any mites do not survive to be introduced into the new colony, or importing from countries where mites are not present. Well, that's great if you know where the mite is not present. And this afternoon I shall come on to the difficulty of proving that something isn't somewhere. What is the risk management options? And it says, ideally, it would be best to prevent Tropidolaps from arriving in the UK in the first instance. A quarantine period before introducing imported queens or used equipment would also prevent mites being introduced to colonies. Yes, indeed. Although it is acknowledged that this is not always feasible or practical. So this is what it says in the risk assessment. And queens should only be imported from countries which can meet the GB health requirements and from areas where the mite is not present. And that assumes that you know where it's not present. How will it move around? Well, this is a new piece of research from Fira Science, which is actually a couple of the UK bee inspectors, Maggie Gill and Dan Etheridge and others, working with colleagues in Thailand. And this is looking at how the mites can survive on various things. And this is quite interesting. Mites survive for only over 96 hours on live adult bees, but over 144 hours on decomposing pupae and up to 168 hours on decomposing adults. These findings demonstrate the mite's ability to survive for extended periods without access to live brood, challenging existing assumptions about its biology and survival limits. So this is basically saying, yes, it can survive much longer in, for example, a queen cage than we might think. And in queen cages, the accompanying workers quite often die. And it turns out they can actually live longer on the dead adults than they can on live ones. So this really does demonstrate an effective pathway for the thing to get from one place to another. And then another paper from, again, Maggie Gill of Fira, but also people from, in the Bee Guards project, Alex Yuzanov and Irakli in Georgia. And this is looking at swarming. And here they conclusively show that Tropidolaps mites can survive quite happily in a swarm and also in foragers, which was already demonstrated. So, this really shows that Tropidolaps can move more effectively than was previously thought. And this is demonstrated by this paper, which only came out a few days ago by this team in the United States who have been working in Thailand with colleagues. And they tried to put down, what is known from the refereed scientific literature. So yes, it did start out in Southeast Asia, but it spread to South Korea quite a long time ago, heading Papua New Guinea, but also heading in this direction. Been in Pakistan, has been in Uzbekistan for some time, possibly in these other countries around, certainly in Georgia and Russia. And we do know that it got to Russia because beekeepers in Russia imported 300,000 colonies from Uzbekistan. Then they noticed that some of them were dying, so they imported some more. So this is a very clear demonstration of the movement in colonies to places that are quite cold in the winter, where it's actually doing quite well. And unfortunately, if you look at the countries around, a lot of them are fairly unstable politically have got wars going on and so on, and have probably got better things to do than write scientific papers saying that Tropilolapsus turned up in my country and so on. So there is a huge lag in the time between something being found in a country and a scientific paper being published. So the Russian one worked pretty swiftly, but it still took about 18 months to get that published. So we have to view this map as out of date, and we have to be very suspicious about countries such as Turkey. And Turkey has strong trading links with Romania, where we import queens from and so on. And so this thing is on the move. I think scientists took their eyes off the ball and assumed it wasn't spreading, and it has spread quite rapidly. So that's all doom and gloom and despondency, but something more pleasant and interesting is a recent survey of honeybee genotypes in Europe. So this was under the auspices of the Better Bee project, which is a big EU-funded project, and Alice Pinto, who spoke last year, is a member of the Better Bee, but she was also involved in the Insignia project that I was involved in, which got beekeepers all around Europe collecting samples for pollution. And she also got all the Insignia partners and me to collect some samples to look at genetics of the honeybees. And this is really the first time it's been done simultaneously on such a large scale. So in the end, there were 1,311 locations in 33 countries over 2022 to 24. So you can see the distribution there. The ones with red spots are supposedly conserved in some way with some legal protection on them. So I was asked to collect about 30 samples from England, Wales and Scotland. So Ireland was covered separately. And what I wanted to do was to try and get a sort of representative collection. So I did ask for samples from some places that I thought would be particularly interesting. So Colonsay in Scotland, the Isle of Man, the Scilly Isles, which I thought were unusual situations. But beyond that, I tried to find a range of people from commercial to amateur beekeepers in different regions, not people who'd imported queens immediately, because that would be rather pointless, but representative of the sort of background population. And so Alice and her colleagues analysed these samples by 3 techniques. So classical wing morphometry compared to mitochondrial DNA analysis, which shows the queen's lineage, and then your nuclear DNA using whole genome sequencing, which shows the contribution of both the queen and the drones, to compare these 3 techniques. And Alice presented the preliminary results of the sort of overall package at the UAB meeting in Estonia and Apimondia last year, and also gave a talk at the BBK Spring Convention last year. But the UK samples, or sorry, the GB samples came through quite recently, and so I can go through those. I can't give you the individual results, but on the mitochondrial DNA, they showed that you have the M, which is essentially Apis mellifera mellifera, the C, which is the Carniolan in Italian lineage, and a little bit of A, which is the African bees, but the A is also represented in Brother Adam's buckfast bees, so that's how it turned up. So overall, by this measure, you've got something like less than half is represented by the M lineage. But if you look at the different haplotypes that are represented, there's the one African, there are a number of different C lineage haplotypes and various M lineage haplotypes. And interestingly, 2 of the sites, so the Isle of Man and a sample from Northumberland, turned up new haplotypes that hadn't been sequenced before, which was quite interesting. So you see the range, and this was the individual samples along the bottom here, their numbers, and this is the nuclear DNA, and split into the contribution from different subspecies. So the blue here is Apis mellifera and mellifera. The purple, or well, it says purple, I would say it's pink, is Iberiensis, and I'll say something about that in a second. And then you've got two separate Carnica, the Carniolan bees. Yellow is Ligustica Italian, and M is Macedonica, the Greek or Macedonian bee. Now the Iberiensis is quite interesting. So the Iberiensis is the bee that is in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, but it does seem to turn up in the Irish samples quite a lot. And there's lots of speculation about why this might be. And these two are clearly closely related. And the suggestion might be that the bees in Ireland and perhaps in England as well are more closely related to the bees of the Iberian Peninsula than reference samples of Apis mellifera and mellifera collected in the east, in Russia and Central Europe. And this is consistent with the idea that after the end of the last ice age, there was a refuge of bees around the Mediterranean, and then they moved northwards into sort of northwestern Europe and headed off up to Ireland, and others spread eastward, and they've diverged a bit. So Grace McCormack in Ireland is very interested in the relationship between Irish bees and Iberiensis and so on. But anyway, you can see some of these. So we're looking at the blue here, and you can see there are a number of samples that are very high percentages of Apis mellifera and mellifera. The colonsay bees, which have been sampled many times over the years, once again come out as very pure. But the sample collected in Northumberland came out even higher than the colonsay bees, which is quite interesting. But elsewhere you can see there's a lot of a mixture. Many sites are very, very mixed up indeed, and John's got into this in a lot of detail and so on. And you can generally say that the further you get away from the southeast of England, the more likely you are to find more pure samples. So Wales, Scotland, Northumberland, and down here in Cornwall, you can find relatively pure samples. And overall, if you average out all these figures, you get 53% of Apis mellifera and mellifera. So that shows that the background of most of these samples is native bee with lots of other things mixed in. And that compares with the random apiary sample that the National Bee Unit did some years ago, which I think came out at 43% or something, possibly not directly comparable, but it shows that there is a lot there in the background. And so then to introduce the rest of the day, something else that happened fairly recently was the International Union for the Conservation of Nature made a statement on wild honeybees. And it's worth noting that the IUCN publishes these red data books for all insect species, and have published a red data book for bees many years ago, and drawn attention to the fact that many species are rare, threatened, etc. And honeybee has always been down as data deficient, despite the fact that it's very common and so on. And that has now been addressed, and so Arrigo Moro, who was working with Grace in Ireland but is now back in Italy, and various colleagues put this together last year. And so, as I say, the honeybee was data deficient, but looking at wild free-living colonies in Europe and looking at how they survive, they came to the conclusion that wild western honeybee populations in the European Union are assessed as endangered, which is their classification. And they also say, notably, population decline data is indicating a similar level of threat for the non-EU countries of Switzerland and England. Now, I know Ollie, who's speaking in a minute, disagrees on the England bit, but what they're saying is these bees are threatened in the natural environment, and I think Ollie will probably speculate why there might be a difference between the colonies in Central Europe and those in England. So this is now the status of wild honeybees in the European Union with the big red mark on it. So that really takes us through to the rest of the day. So I shall stop there and endeavour to answer any questions, and I shall follow it up this afternoon. So, any questions? Yes?
You know, on that chart where you show the high prevalence of AMN in the UK, which is that, have you looked at Europe and seen how, is there less AMN in Europe?
Yeah, so I mean the overall results unfortunately show that most of Europe is really dominated by C lineage bees, particularly in places such as France and Germany, which were formerly within the AMM range. There are only relic populations. So there are some pockets in France. There are a lot of very hybridised bees in France, and bees that were thought to be native bees turn out not to be. Ireland does have probably the greatest density of pretty pure colonies, but Grace is very concerned about that being harmed by imports. And you don't find that anything comparable until you get right over into the Ural Mountains of Russia, where you've got these free-living colonies in the Urals and so on, which are very pure black bees as well. But across the middle of its range, it's largely been wiped out.
So do we think the AMN is coming from free-living colonies in this country?
No. I mean, the colonies I sent samples from are beekeepers' hives.
Could the drones from free-living?
Yeah, drones from free-living colonies obviously can contribute, but we were talking yesterday about the PhD that was done by Catherine Thompson about 15 years ago now. She was based at Leeds University in the National Bee Unit, and what she was doing was she was looking at pairs of free-living colonies and a managed colony nearby, and collecting samples from both and looking at a whole range of things, looking at the genetics, the disease and so on. And she basically found that there was no significant difference between the genetics of those bees or the disease presence. There was a difference because the ones in the trees or houses weren't treated for varroa, but they were essentially the same bees. So she or her supervisors concluded that that means that there are no wild honeybees in Britain. And as a further part of her thesis, she went off to places where there are no recorded honeybee beekeepers, and she put out bait hives and traps and didn't find any bees, and concluded that there weren't any wild bees. But these are places where you wouldn't expect to find any bees. So as I say, the conclusion in the thesis is that there are no wild populations, and that all of the ones living in trees and houses have come directly from beekeepers' hives. But an alternative way of looking at her data is that actually you've got a continuous bee population, some of which lives in trees and some of which lives in hives. And we know that in Africa you have a continuous population of bees, most of which are living free, and a small number are in hives. But we probably in Europe have the reverse situation where the majority are in hives. But when you start looking, Ollie has found free-living colonies wherever he looks. And I think we're on the verge of realising that actually we probably do have this continuous population. And going back to the import figures, yes, 30,000 queens a year is a huge number, but if you've got 250,000 managed colonies and however many free-living colonies, that input of exotic material is actually quite a small proportion of the total. So most of the population out there is not relying on that. So I think we're sort of on the verge of finding that there probably are a lot of free-living colonies out there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just from my experience over the years, we see bees come in where some years they're very, very, very dark, and then you might get integration, someone brings in some buckfast, and then your colony changes colour. So, from like Catherine's research, she's just at one
Yes, a snapshot. Yes,
and,
absolutely.
Next year or 2 years later, there could be many more.
Yeah. And many of us know Roger Patterson, who's just down the road from me, who spent a lot of his time removing colonies from barns and roofs and all sorts of strange places. And, he says most of the ones he finds are dark bees, although you would occasionally find one with a marked queen in it and bright orange bees that clearly haven't been there very long. Yeah. So it's an area to be explored. Yeah, I think we've got to move on. So I shall hand over to Ollie.